This is Writers' Voices. I'm Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and mother, Caroline Kilburn. And we actually have a double show today. We have two authors. And, Mom, let's introduce the first one.
The first one is Brian David Johnson and Jan Eagleson, co-authors of MWD, Hell is Coming Home. And it's a very interesting book. Something about the authors. Brian is a journalist and entrepreneur. Jan is an independent filmmaker and writer. This is their first book for young adults. They both live in Boston, Massachusetts. Of course, the illustrator then is, I'm not sure.
We'll ask Brian to pronounce the illustrator's name. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Brian.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, is this your first graphic novel?
Yeah, the first graphic novel efforts. We actually initially wrote this as a screenplay, and Candlewick Press liked the material and decided that it would be something they would really like to turn into a graphic novel. So we adapted our original screenplay and turned it into a graphic novel manuscript. And then the illustrators, Carl Stevens and Lela Malevsky, illustrated the book.
Well, I want to talk more about how that whole process worked. But first, let's talk a little bit about what this book is about. MWD, Hell is Coming Home. MWD, of course, stands for Military Working Dog. And this book follows a young woman's return from war and her bond with two dogs, one who saves her life in Iraq and another who helps her reclaim it at home. What inspired this book for you?
A number of things inspired it. Primarily my co-author, Jan Eagleson, was the spark behind it. He has had a long career in film and theater in Boston, and he had long delved into the subject of PTSD and soldiers coming home from war, but he really wanted to do a story about a woman coming home from war, and he is a dog lover, and wanted to do a story about a female dog handler who comes home and what she would experience coming home from war and how she would react to her return, as well as understanding a little bit about what she faced while she was serving in the military. For myself, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. In some respects, my sister-in-law was a therapist, social worker who worked with returning veterans, particularly female veterans. And then I had another sister-in-law who was a dog trainer who worked with German Shepherds and police dogs.
So that's how you were able to able to research it without having been there yourself.
Yeah, definitely was able. Those were, I think, the foundation of the research. I did an extensive amount of research about both subjects, about what women face serving in the war, and in particular this war, the Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the conditions they served in, as well as a good deal of research about how post-traumatic stress disorder manifests itself, particularly in women.
Mm. When you said you set out to write this as a screenplay, you did write it as a screenplay? Have you done screenplays before?
Yes, I've been writing for as long as I can remember. Initially, I started my career script reader for 20th Century Fox about 20 years ago, and was writing scripts then as well. Then I made a turn into journalism and worked for the Associated Press and daily newspapers, business publications. I still work in the journalism space. I'm a publisher of several magazines in my day job, but it's always been a passion of mine, doing these screenplays and short stories and now graphic novels.
Well, I'm curious how the screenplay came to the attention of a book publisher.
Yeah, so we had done the screenplay with the intention that we would create it, produce it ourselves, Jan would direct it, and we were kind of plodding along there, and he had written another graphic novel about his father's experience in World War II, and he was actually pitching that to Candlewick Press, and they didn't feel that the content was something they were interested in working with him on, and they had asked him sort of off the cuff, well, what else do you have? And he sort of said, well, I have this screenplay. I don't think you should that. And they said, well, maybe we would. What is it about? Told them. And much to our delight, they were very interested in that. And they called us in. We had a wonderful meeting, and they basically made us the offer right then and there. And we said yes.
Wow, serendipity at work, huh?
That's the best kind.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, I think the illustrator, in this case, had a really good handle on people's emotions, because she could express them in their faces, quite well, and their body language too. Although, of course, they're not moving, but still, there's a she was able to do that. It was well done.
When it came to obviously in a graphic novel, the illustrations are a very important aspect, and it seems like, in some sense, like when you wrote the script for the graphic novel, like in a screenplay, you have directions for the action. Do you do that for this as well?
So we focus very hard on how you show complicated internal struggles visually. So one of the things that we tried to do was really, instead of using exposition or telling people what the character was feeling, what we tried to do was really focus in on language and actions that would convey it more subtly, but also convey emotions very clearly. It's all kind of, I think it was very much dictated in the dialogue, how people would react. And when you write a screenplay, you write screen directions. But you can also be pretty colorful in the prose that you use to describe action. And I tend to write that way anyways. I use the screen action part to really try and write some descriptive prose about what the action and what is happening. Of course, it's all then left up to the skilled hands of an illustrator to convey that. And I would say that we gave them, in some respects, a very difficult job. A lot of our struggles that our character faces are somewhat internal, and there really is no good guys and bad guys. She really is kind of both of those contained into one. So I think that they did a great job with a difficult task.
There's whole pages without dialogue, and what's the term for like each separate panel? Okay, so did you like give a detailed description of what you wanted for each panel?
Not in this case. What we did was we would write the scene almost as if it was a play or a screenplay or a manuscript, and then it was up to the illustrator to separate each action into a panel. And it's interesting, my mom, when she first read the book, she's like, "Oh, I really like it, but I don't. Did you do a lot of writing for it?"
Yeah, there's not a lot of words in the book itself, is there?
Well, yeah, everything that she does, we wrote, right? So it's just all part of the process, and I think that's why it's an interesting art form, especially for a writer, because you do have to, all of us want to go into a book reading and read our really flowery prose and the wonderful turns of phrases we can all use, but this is a medium that's really about story more than about your skill as a writer. So it's more about your skill as a storyteller. And,
oh, interesting.
That resonates with me actually a little bit more.
Well, it seems like with your background in screenwriting, both you and Jan, in background in film, it seems like this would be kind of a logical extension of that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's also, I think, an extension of my years as being a reporter. I had great people who taught me how to write for the news, and you learn very quickly that there's just a big difference between showing and telling. And I remember my first journalism professor said, "Nobody runs fast; they just run." that always stuck with me. So I use an economy of words. So I think that's better or worse. That's how I write now.
That's a good advice, actually.
That's great advice.
Yeah. Were you then, did the publisher assign the illustrators to you?
So typically how Candlewick Press does it is the manuscript comes first, and then once they've signed off on the manuscript, they've accepted your final draft, then they will go out and find illustrators and contract with them. We had a little more input with the illustration, just because it was such a long book, and we had a difficult time finding the right illustrators. Illustrators are in pretty high demand, and especially the very good ones. And a graphic novel for an illustrator is a tremendous amount of work. It's at least 18 months, and that's if you're producing 2 pages a day.
Wow.
Basically. So, if you can imagine that level of detail, it's hard to find an illustrator who wants to put that much time in. And because, when you average it all out, it's not a heck of a lot of money when you contextualize it.
Now, you mentioned that there were 2 illustrators, Lela Malevsky and Carl Stevens. How did they work together?
So we have 2 distinct, I would say, sections of our book. One is our character Liz when she's in Iraq in the theater of war, and then we have Liz when she's at home. And what we felt would be a really useful narrative tool would be to have separate illustrators depict those 2 distinct points in her life. When a soldier's at war, their senses are heightened. Everything is crystal clear. You're always on very high alert, and so therefore we wanted to convey that through very crisp, detailed drawings. And then when you're home, when you come home from war, you are. Some people describe it as being in a fog, being wrapped in saran wrap. A lot of the soldiers struggle when they come home is to find themselves, and so we wanted somebody who could portray that in a little bit more of an ethereal way, maybe even a little bit more fuzzy way. So Lela illustrated that part, and it's a subtle difference, but it was something that we thought would be another way to kind of convey the difficulties of coming home from war, and how you do change, and you change both externally and internally.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Brian David Johnson, co-author of MWD, Hell is Coming Home, about a young woman's return from war and her bond with her dogs. Now, tell us a little bit more about how you worked with the illustrators. Like, did you get the week's panels to give feedback on, or how involved were you in the actual illustration process?
We were pretty involved. We would get a batch of pages every few months to take a look at. Sometimes we would get them. It happens in phases. So at first we got rough sketches, which were basically stick figures and panels, and with dialogue, so you could see roughly how they wanted to stage out the action. And we were asked for feedback then. Then we would receive art sporadically after that, pencil sketches and things like that. And then they would have questions as well in terms of continuity and saying, well, she says on page 20 this, but it looks like we have this illustrated. What do you think if we change this line? So it was a lot of detail work like that. So essentially what we try to do, which they do in animation all the time, is you go back to the writers to adapt a new line to match something that the illustrator did.
So it's really a back and forth, a very collaborative effort.
Yes, the whole process is very collaborative. I would say most collaboration happened between me and Jan as we were writing it. But, we had some time to talk to the illustrators to explain to them just any questions they might have about the character. We really were adamant that, Liz, it's all in Liz's face. These lines will work if her face expresses these things, and just pay particular attention to how you use those facial expressions. And I think that they were both very good about that.
I'm curious, Brian, as to why you choose to write in collaboration. Now, with the illustration, I can see, obviously authors and illustrators are usually two different breeds, and that you need collaboration on that. But in the writing process, what is it, that Jan brings that I'm assuming you think that the end product is better with both inputs. What is it that makes that true?
Well, I have always been a pretty collaborative person, but I think it does go back to writing is a very solitary process, and oftentimes when you're writing by yourself, if you spend a lot of time thinking of things and trying not to write yourself into a corner, which happens all the time, and you spend a whole lot of time coming up with solutions, trying not to paint yourself into a corner. As where if you work with a partner, and how we did it is that once we had come up with baseline ideas, I would go back and write, and then I would bring pages to Jan, and then Jan would read them, and then we would have long discussions about the scene and decide if the character was actually what the character was thinking. He would do a lot of what if she said this, what if she did that. And what he did particularly well was internalize and explain the internal dialogue of a character. And he would often push against my logical side with more of an emotional side. So he always wanted to have the character, what I call starting in the middle. He would want the character to do something very outrageous or very unpredictable. And I would always have to, we would argue the merits of that. And then a lot of times he would actually win that argument, and then I would go back and just make it work technically. And I did all the research, and he did a lot of the emotional research. So it worked very well in that sense. He's a dramatist. I'm a journalist, and I think that created a much more realistic portrayal of a person. I sometimes got too wrapped up in the idea that everything had to be substantiated by fact, and when you're doing a piece on people in the military and people who are real life, these are not real life people, but there's a lot of you don't want to make mistakes, and so I was always trying to make sure that everything we did was authentic and could happen in real life. So
well, I know that these
collaboration was really helpful.
these dogs are extremely valuable in the military, because especially the bomb-sniffing dogs, but all of them are. What happens to the dogs after their handlers leave, after they're mustered out? Then what happens? What becomes of the dog?
So, dog handlers can adopt their dogs now. But dogs are extremely valuable to the military, and up until I think 2000, they were considered military equipment, and so handlers were not allowed to adopt their dogs.
Well, the bond that
push to when the dogs retire, to allow them to retire with their handlers as well.
I mean, the bond that's obviously between the dog and the handler. I think that's a really good rule that they've changed, that the handler can adopt the dog if they choose, because that handler depended on that dog for life saving, and then to have to walk away from him must have been really hard.
Yes, very emotionally taxing. And actually, in our original screenplay, that was really what the story was about, was that she had been separated from her dog and was fighting like hell to get the dog back.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually had to make a change in the narrative when we converted it to a graphic novel for young adults. So we had to kind of eliminate that and pivot to a different type of story. But military working dogs are some of the most valuable soldiers in the military, especially in these wars where bomb sniffing is critical.
Yep.
And sadly, the Taliban in Afghanistan actually targets military working dogs now because they are so.
Because they know how valuable they are. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and a soldier returning and going through the emotional difficulties, I would think that if they had been a handler, having the dog there would be very beneficial.
Absolutely, and I think animals in general are very beneficial to soldiers who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They use them as therapy a lot, and they are very effective. The dog is a great tool if you sort of are feeling conflicted about the human species. Usually, you can find a lot of virtue in a dog. And there were some times when we were writing this one, I was like, well, it seems like some of the best men in this book is actually the dog. They're a great literary tool as well. You can imbue them with a whole lot of great characteristics.
So, do you have another graphic novel in mind for the future?
Yes. I'm working on sort of several at the same time, all in various levels of completion. It's a field that I find really exciting. It can be tough because it does take a very long time to get to have these see the world. So, I'm experimenting with different styles, perhaps in a book with illustration rather than a straight up comic book, comic book type. But it's one of the most. It's the only genre of fiction that sales have increased over the last few years. So,
I was just going to ask about that, about where the kind of the graphic novel is in the pantheon of genres, and
growing in terms of reputation. The book March by Congressman John Lewis was very widely recognized as an important piece of literature. I think people gravitate to the medium, and in terms of films, they tend to get made into movies a lot because they're very easy to adapt because they've already gone through that visual transformation. And it could be a very experimental medium, and I mean, if you go to independent comic festivals, you can see all types of comic books and graphic novels that are out there of all types of genres. It's not just superheroes. It's internal stories. It's everyday stories. So it's a very versatile medium.
Are you going to be focusing on this medium yourself going forward, or you said you're still doing a lot of kind of traditional journalism as well?
Well, this is a great pursuit for me. I do have 2 children I have to raise and put through college, and so one book every 10 years. I don't think I'm going to be doing it.
How long did it take you to on this book? How long did you work on it?
Oh, in actuality, the writing only took a couple years, but to see the light of day, it took quite a few years for it to all come together. So we started the book in 2007, believe it or not, and
wow. So it really was 10 years.
Yeah, I don't think they don't.
Good.
No, I'm cursed with a diverse array of interests, skills, and I have a wonderful career as a media entrepreneur. I've started 4 publications and have done very well at that. So I'm always participating in writing in some aspect or another. But I continue to work to make graphic novels, and this is not going to be the end of that pursuit by any stretch.
Well, I'd like to tell our listeners that if you're not familiar with graphic novels, this is a very interesting place to start.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
it's been a long time since I read one, and I enjoyed it. Yeah,
it's a serious subject, and it's a really kind of approachable way, and a very accessible way to learn about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's very kind.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Brian.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. And we're going to take a short music. And thank you so much for listening, tuning in to Writers' Voices today. See you next week.